Hi, everybody. My name's Paul McGee. I'm the director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal people in the room, online with us, and elders past and present. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Artie McCarthy, who is currently a lecturer in global studies at the University of Canberra. Their work is focused on children's participation in development programs. Their 2021 book, Children and NGOs in India, Development as Storytelling and Performance, documented the ways slum children in Delhi creatively pursue their own projects of development through participation in NGO programs. More recently, they've begun to build on their ethnographic research by exploring the historical dimensions of children and young people's participation in development, humanitarianism, and peace activism, both in the global south and the global north. In particular, they are interested in the transnational flows of child-authored materials, drawings, stories, poems, letters, exploring their role in making and enacting humanitarianism, internationalism, and highlighting their critiques and grievances against the adult world. And just before I ask you to join me in welcoming Artie, I'd just like to say for the people who are online, we're going to request that if you have any comments or questions, can you please use the chat function, and we'll read them when we get to question time. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Artie.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you so much for everyone coming here today. I also want to start by acknowledging Ngunnawal country and the other families and communities who have connections to this beautiful country here in Canberra that sustains us and makes all of our work possible. While this paper today does not explicitly address Indigenous histories of Australia, it does highlight the way First Nations communities of Turtle Island, North America, contributed and were incorporated into global projects of humanitarianism via the Red Cross. And though I am not talking about Indigenous Australian children today, I think it's really worth emphasising that from the outset, the more of this work that I do, the more I come to realise how important the figure of the Indigenous child is to the construction of child-focused projects of internationalism and humanitarianism in the early part of the 20th century. While many Indigenous children come to participate in these projects through institutions that are premised on the genocidal logics of assimilation, their participation, when it is represented and circulated by international networks, typically rarefies and emphasises their indigeneity to children around the globe. There is a paradox here that requires careful untangling, and I'm not really sure that I'm the person to do it, although I do wonder about what role I could play even in identifying the kinds of material held in humanitarian organisations' archives that might warrant repatriation to Indigenous communities. So before I tell you something about my new graphic novel project, which is called Joka and the Blue Rabbit, which I'm going to come to at the end, I want to situate it within my broader work and a number of key scholarly debates and ethical questions about humanitarianism and its histories. For a number of years, I've been working on a broader project, which in my head, which is where it mostly exists, I call crafting humanitarianism. So this project, as the verb form crafting would suggest, is interested in how humanitarianism is made and what it is made of. And here I take the anthropologist Didier Fascine's definition of humanitarianism, which is on the slide here, connoting both dimensions encompassed by the concept of humanity. On the one hand, the generality of human beings who share a similar condition, mankind, and on the other, an effective movement drawing humans towards their fellows, humaneness. But as well as understanding the makings of humanitarianism as an effective movement, the word craft also helps me understand humanitarianism's material dimensions, its manual dexterities, its creativities, and its craftiness, and even its deceptions. So in particular, I'm interested in children and young people's contribution to the project of crafting humanitarianism. And these are my very broad research questions. How do children and young people produce humanitarianism through acts of making and performing? How can we better understand children's long-standing participation in humanitarianisms through engagement with children's creative work and the institutional and pedagogical tools that elicit this work? So I became interested in this work primarily through my own ethnographic fieldwork in NGOs, which Paul mentioned so nicely in my introduction. And what I saw in these NGO spaces in Delhi is given away in my book's subtitle, which emphasizes that what I observed was essentially development playing out as storytelling and performance. Now, while we might critique this form of development as inadequate in light of kind of stark inequalities, this was not really the kind of critique I heard from the child participants in the programs that I worked in. So in order to understand the volume of creative production, I saw children engaged in NGOs in Delhi, and increasingly saw, when I looked around the world at what other NGOs were doing, I began to kind of figure out, well, what is this happening? And I began to think, well, how long has this been going on for? Initially I thought, oh, this must be a recent thing, and of course, it's just a recent thing. But what I actually found when I started to look into this a lot more is actually a real continuity of creativity by children and young people who are both recipients and receivers of aid from the early part of the 20th century onwards, when we see the really kind of rise of international kind of development networks. We see kind of children's creativity emerge along with that. So what I had thought was an isolated or recent phenomenon initially turned out to be much broader and gave me a different perspective on key questions and ethical issues raised by humanitarianism. And I just want to try to highlight what these kind of questions and ethical issues and paradoxes are for me, just with these two quotes here, sorry, on the slide, both from anthropologists, again, who work in this field. So the first one by Miriam Tickton says that, insofar as it focuses on individuals and not structural realities, compassion cannot by itself further a politics of equality. Perhaps more importantly, in its current institutionalized forms, humanitarianism actually maintains inequality in that it separates out two populations: those who can feel and act on their compassion, and those who must be the subjects or objects of it, those who have the power to protect, and those who need protection. Now, Didier Fassin highlights this in a slightly different way when he writes, "A remarkable paradox deserves our attention here. On the one hand, moral sentiments are focused mainly on the poorest, the most unfortunate, the most vulnerable individuals. The politics of compassion is a politics of inequality. On the other hand, the condition of possibility of moral sentiments is generally the recognition of others as fellows. The politics of compassion is a politics of solidarity. This tension between inequality and solidarity, between a relation of domination and a relation of assistance, is constitutive of all humanitarian government." So children and images of children are often key components in this paradoxical construction. So here on the slide are some images that depict children as victims. In this poster here from Belgium Relief from 1917, from Near East Relief from 1918, and from 1919. This was one of the first pamphlets of the Save the Children Fund, highlighting the starvation induced by post-war blockades in Europe. So this is the one side of the coin. This is the kind of the complete kind of inequalities, the complete ultra focus on victims. Conversely, here children are employed to represent the kind of the magnanimous position of the donor, or the position of the person who, through whatever privileges of race or history, are perceived as able to act on their compassion and become part of kind of these kind of global movements in a role of an active, creative kind of giver. And again, once again, children here are enlisted to illustrate this. But while these examples illustrate the poles of the spectrum, really, many children who have participated in humanitarianism, I think, don't actually sit very neatly at each end of this spectrum. And I'm increasingly finding examples of diverse groups of children who contribute in creative ways to humanitarianism, even while receiving material assistance such as food aid. And so I became interested in asking questions like these on the slide. So, how can a focus on crafting participation and creativity disrupt binary constructions of victims and saviors, or recipients and providers, that maintain inequality in relations of domination? You can see I'm using Tickton's words there partially. And what kinds of transnational humanitarian networks and affects are established through the global circulation of child-produced materials and accounts of children's participation? This is largely what we're going to be looking into today. And this frieze that was actually, this is made by French children during World War I, is an example of this kind of globally circulating objects. And how could a history of humanitarianism based on child participants or child-made objects teach us about what animates or fails to animate movements of solidarity, drawing humans towards their fellows? So before I kind of lose the kind of really critically minded among you, it is worth saying that I take on the figure of the child here, deeply aware of its co-options by humanitarianism. So it's worth being very, very suspicious here. So the anthropologist Lisa Melky, I think, is very astute here in asking, well, why are children's images everywhere in humanitarianism? Why are they everywhere? What do these images do, and what do they depend on for their efficacy? And she argues, according to her analysis, that images of children very consistently appear in 5 interrelated registers. As embodiments of basic human goodness and symbols of world harmony, as sufferers, we've just seen that, as seers of truth, as ambassadors of peace, and embodiments of the future. And these registers depend on each other for their affective and ritual efficacy. Now, this idea of kind of ritual efficacy is further highlighted by Melky when she talks about how these registers actually place children on what she calls an ethereal pedestal. And what she means by this is that there is actually like kind of the pedestal is not actually real, it's, you know, it's imagined. And she says, from this pedestal, it is nearly impossible for actual children to act in the world as effective political historical subjects. They are set apart by adults in an infantile utopian dimension that is freely celebrated and almost as freely ignored. They are called upon to speak for mankind and ritually miniaturized into silence. They are made the mere, but all this could be otherwise. Now, Melky isn't the only one to make these kind of claims about children's abilities to kind of act on history. Recently, children's historian Sarah Muzzer argued that children's activity in the past may be best conceptualized not as agency, but as performance. Now, I think most theorists of performance would actually reject the oppositional construction here of agency and performance. So again, I don't buy that at all, but I do. The only thing I can really find much hope in this slide is Melky's idea that all this could be otherwise. And I actually think that the otherwise is far less ethereal or kind of impossible than one might imagine. Precisely because children's participation in humanitarianism is so freely celebrated, there are abundant traces of it in the archive, and in fact, living examples happening every day in NGO programs and refugee camps around the globe. So for things to be otherwise, scholars have to stop ignoring this material and actually explore its creation, use and misuse, its circulation and its material and effective force. So to demonstrate this today, I'm going to be using material from the Red Cross and the Junior Red Cross in the period throughout World War I and immediately afterwards. So the simple story about children in the Red Cross is that the Red Cross formed in 1863 and that children didn't actually get involved till 1914 when the Junior Red Cross was officially formed. But try telling this to the school children in the Netherlands who were asked to collect funds to provide relief for wounded or sick victims of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, or the American children who worked with the Red Cross to assist victims of the San Francisco earthquake, which destroyed 80% of the city in 1906. So there's many kind of prehistories to the kind of official entry of children into the kind of official history of the Red Cross. But officially, though, the Junior Red Cross was formed almost simultaneously in Australia and Canada. And depending on what you read, there's a big debates about this, who actually did it first. Obviously, the Australians will claim that we did it first, and I think we did. In August, actually, 1914, the first branches of the Junior Red Cross were formed in New South Wales. And it was not until October in Saskatchewan, I think, when the first branches were formed in Canada. Now, again, we could have a debate about this. I've read different stories that put different accounts first, but I'm going to go with the August New South Wales. We're leading the front there, founded in New South Wales Junior Red Cross. So in Australia, the juniors contributed to the war effort, obviously, as well as raising funds for humanitarian agencies like the Commission for Belgian Relief. The effort was immense. In 1915, the New South Wales Red Cross record noted that during 1 month alone, 50,000 garments were made by women and children of New South Wales for soldiers and such things like that. And here we see an enormous pile of Christmas gifts of sweets and snacks for wounded soldiers contributed by the children of New South Wales. So this accumulation took place on a grand scale, but it was actually often the work of very tiny communities. And there's all of these accounts in the kind of periodicals from the Red Cross at this time. So just one, the school children of Devlin School in Ashbridge, New South Wales, made and contributed 10 chest protectors, 2 cholera belts, 2 handkerchiefs, and 6 yards of calico for bandages in 1915. So as well as being the combined effort of thousands of small communities, children's war work during this period is often deeply personal. In a letter from 12-year-old Minnie Anson from Lithgow to the New South Wales Red Cross Record in March 1917, she wrote that, "I'm determined to try to describe to you what I've done for the Red Cross in the past and what I hope to do in the future." Minnie's letter, which describes her work knitting garments and selling flowers, concluded by noting that she has 2 brothers serving in France. Another letter from 8-year-old Barbara Spencer to President Woodrow Wilson shows a girl giving up the money she had been saving for a pony. This latter story was printed in the US Red Cross magazine under the heading Anecdotes That Count, and it indicates the way, the performative way these children's efforts were used. In this case, this story was also picked up by a host of newspapers who all printed Barbara's letter. I'm a little girl, 8 years old. I've been saving money for a pony, which I'm now giving to the Red Cross kind of thing. Repeating this kind of celebrating her kind of this individual act of a child's generosity. Yet while Barbara may have only contributed $23, one estimate suggests that American juniors who only began their war work in the fall of 1917, by the war's end had produced 15 million useful articles and $10 million in cash to help win the war. So while it might be easy to think of this money as just belonging to their parents anyway, it is worth stressing that Red Cross publications from this time strongly advise children not to ask their parents for money, actually, and encourage them to earn their money for the Red Cross membership and donations through doing odd jobs, making items for sale, or putting on performances and charging an entry fee, which was quite a common thing to do. Stories about particular efforts of waste collection, recycling, and gardening, harvesting crops abound. The American Red Cross reported that in Southern California, juniors harvested castor oil beans from vacant farmland. In Leahy County, Idaho, they collected 500 pounds of wool that had got trapped on trees and wire fences of the sheep ranges. During the season of sudden rains in Minnesota, one youngster capitalized on the weather by standing on a street corner with an umbrella, ready to take people home to their car for 5 cents. So again, there's all these creative stories about how children raise this money. So children's actions are here either presented abstractly as very large figures of money or incidentally as charming little anecdotes. And I think this goes a long way towards understanding why they've been neglected in scholarly accounts. Likewise, while much of the scholarship on this period and the efforts of women and children has focused on war work and patriotism and has used a kind of nationalist kind of lens to explore those questions, what is lost in this scholarship that typically takes the years 1914 to 1918 as hermetically sealed from the rest of history is actually the ongoing nature of this work. So particularly when we focus on children's contributions and participation in the Red Cross, we see only an exceptional expansion in the post-war period as the organisation adopted a peacetime mission and the concept of service expanded beyond the straightforwardly patriotic. So by 1922, the Junior Red Cross had officially been organised in 22 countries, and by 1927 in 40 countries. And you can see here the distribution of the Junior Red Cross membership on this map. And here by 1928, it had a global membership of just over 10 million. Significantly though, as you can see here in this table from 1928, the Junior Red Cross actually has a greater membership, over 10 million, than the adult membership of the organisation, which is sitting at 8.6 million here. And if we start breaking it down a bit and looking at individual countries, we can see in Australia, for example, juniors made up 89% of the Red Cross membership. And Australia was not unique in this regard. And we see children's membership in a number of countries on both sides of the conflict, or actually outweighing by a significant margin the adult memberships and kind of dwarfing adult participation. So given that membership was monetized, even though this money was kind of a very small amount, it also indicates a significant portion of funds that came from children during this period, not to mention the labour and effective buy-in to keep the movement alive. And it's quite remarkable that actually there's been no, as far as I know, there's been no full book-length study of the Junior Red Cross as a global movement, despite this huge kind of effort and huge numbers of people involved. But what were these children doing? So if you ask the American Junior Red Cross, and we look at this poster here, they were enrolling for service. But before we unpack what this means, I just want to quickly comment on this adult creative production of this poster. Now, this poster was painted by a woman by the name of Anna Milo Upjohn, who actually served as the artist for the American Red Cross. She started working for them around 1917, 1918. And we can see her here drawing from life in the field. So during the war and the latter part of the war, she traveled around Europe documenting the scenes and kind of publishing these images for various formats in Red Cross magazines. She made posters. This is an example of a poster she made for a kind of baby kind of saving show that they ran during France during the war. So the fact that the Red Cross kind of had an official artist, I think, during this period, and she was officially employed by the Junior Red Cross for some of this period as well, producing material for children, I think is really significant. And it highlights the kind of the plethora of kind of visual materials that were being produced in this time, and also the kind of multiple formats in which they were being produced in. So I think while this is not the main focus of my project, I think looking at children's creative work, we can't actually just seal that off from the kind of creative works that were produced for children. So this is also a kind of thread in this research project, some of the artists who did this work during this period. So if we come back to this poster, we can see that it represents a kind of a whole diverse group of children. And a lot of the posters that from the Red Cross, but also other organizations that begin to talk about internationalism, such as the Junior League of Nations, they all kind of use this similar imagery of diversity. And so I want to kind of lead you into what I'm really going to be talking about today, which is the kind of photographic archives of the American Red Cross, by actually kind of starting off with this image and thinking about, well, actually, how realistic is this depiction of diversity? So the main collection that I've been using to kind of produce my research, but will use to actually answer that question that I just raised, is the American Red Cross's photographic collection. And there's around 20,000 digitized glass plate negatives from the American Red Cross, all digitized by the Library of Congress. And the American National Archive also contains thousands of images and index cards. So the ones from the archives look like this. They're like more with an index card format, whereas the ones from the Library of Congress are more just the glass plate negative. So to start with this question of diversity. So on the left of this slide here, we see the Junior Red Cross Auxiliary from Oak Creek in South Dakota, which, as the caption explained, is composed of descendants of Sioux Indians. And on the right, we see the Junior Red Cross Native Red Cross chapter from Juneau in Alaska. The captions of these images speak to the colonial logics of their production, with Oak Creek Juniors described as descendants rather than simply Sioux. These accounts also emphasize productivity. The work of Native women and juniors from Juneau was exhibited in a local emporium, with news articles reporting the substantial amount produced by the juniors and commenting that it would be hard to find Red Cross workers of greater enthusiasm. Another news article about the Juneau Juniors takes its readers, and I quote, down into the native village, in the government native school, where the teacher has organised the native schoolgirls into a dexterous, immaculately uniformed band of knitters, to whom she has carefully imparted a clear understanding of the reasons for which they knit. So here we find juniors who are in a segregated school system. The systems were segregated. Indigenous children were in a different school system to non-Indigenous children at this time in Alaska. So here we see these juniors participating in the school system that functions on the logics of assimilation. So from this perspective, it's not hard to see how children's work for the Red Cross becomes part of the genocidal policies of settler colonialism. While particularly stark in this case, I think, grappling with materials produced by children for the Red Cross always to some degree involves grappling with questions of coercion, violence, child institutionalization, and removal. It also involves grappling with rarefied representations of indigeneity, as I suggested at the start of this presentation, and it's perhaps perfectly illustrated here in this caption of this image, which reads, Zuni Junior Red Cross, 300 strong, right wing of cross girls in native costume, background of ancient Pueblo houses. Yet it wasn't just in settler colonial context. The Australian Red Cross mobilised children in Nausori in Fiji, which was the home of the colonial sugar refining company. Yes, CSR sugar, the sugar that we have in our tea. I did not realise that it stood for Colonial Sugar Refining Company. And CSR was working in Fiji, and it had its kind of factory, and the people in that, they had like a school for the children in that village, and those children were kind of giving objects to Australian soldiers during World War I. The US also exported its Junior Red Cross to work in its colonies, and we can see here from this slide showing its work in the Philippines that it both enlisted children as kind of workers and producers of humanitarian materials, and also pictured them as kind of objects of rescue almost simultaneously. In Puerto Rico, by 1920, every child in public school was a member of the Junior Red Cross. Roughly 100,000 young members who contributed some $22,000 to the Red Cross, most of which was spent in Puerto Rico itself, building things like a sanatorium for children with tuberculosis. And again, some of this money goes back into projects of children's institutionalization, which I think is interesting as well. The American Red Cross reported that perhaps one of the most striking features about the Junior Red Cross in Puerto Rico has been the fact that at least half of the members are children of poor families. Many of them have had to sell something or deprive themselves of something in order to raise a small fee of 25 cents. The simple fact throws a very vivid light on the fineness of these children's achievements. And this is kind of their language and the way they're holding up these children as kind of models and exemplars. But I think it also says something about the kind of intermediary position of many of the children who are participating in these projects, that are neither simply kind of white benevolent benefactors or kind of abject victims. The Junior Red Cross was also exported by religious organizations, such as in this case, which is the Junior Red Cross Auxiliary of St. Mary's School in Shanghai, which mobilized children to do work such as that pictured on the right, distributing pamphlets on the prevention of cholera. But for the American Red Cross, diversity could also be found closer to home. And here this is overtly showcased in this photograph, whose caption reads, Junior Red Cross members of nationalities who gave circus. They say Italian, Austrian, American, Spanish, Syrian, Bohemian, Russian, Slavish, African, Polish, and French. So each of these images can open up countless research threads in their own right, but I present them here predominantly to give you a sense of the breadth of this photographic archive and a sense of some of the stories it might contain. Many of these images are deeply striking, and these are just two of my absolute favorites. Some contain no information at all, not even a country like the one on the left, which I have no idea where it is, but I figure you should be able to find because there's clearly some boarded up monument there. Is it in a museum? Is it a church? I don't know. One day I'll find out where this image was taken. So they contain no information at all. Others emphasize the Red Cross work at the expense of engaging with their subjects, such as the caption on this image on the right, which says, "This son of a Hungarian peasant is typical of a class in his country who have benefited by the helping hand extended by the Americans through their Red Cross and other relief agencies." Which doesn't really tell us anything about this boy. It tells us a lot more about how the organizations viewed themselves. Sometimes you can find the same image in both archives and they get slightly different levels of description. So this one in the Library of Congress simply just says Italian children, even though it's clearly just one child. And this one says Italian child on the hills above Rome, Italy. So we get a little bit more information in that one. Sometimes you can trace how the Red Cross went on to use these images as well. So in this case, I found this image with the caption Calabria, two little waifs of war, typical of the children seen by thousands in Calabria. Again, doesn't really give us much information. And then we see how it's been used as the front cover of the Junior Red Cross News several years later with the background kind of whited out. Some of the images do come with little stories. And again, I really love this one image in particular. This caption says, "He sells a good cauliflower, a boy vegetable vendor in the Balkans, two baskets evenly balanced on a pole across his shoulders. His mother raises the truck in a small garden on the edge of town. Every day he calls at the American Red Cross house and leaves a cauliflower with the compliments of his mother, who was once a patient in the American hospital." We get a little snapshot here. Other images showcase the performative and effective work of children. Here we see 50 juniors from Brno in Czechoslovakia performing in a Junior Red Cross festival in 1921. And there's heaps of it. I've got so many images of children performing in pageants like this, all dressed up, and I kind of find them incredibly interesting, and I want to find a way to use them. But as well as these kinds of group photographs of performance and pageants, some images also showcase individual children's efforts. So this is another image from the Junior Red Cross Festival in Czechoslovakia. And looking at it, we wouldn't necessarily know what on earth is going on, but luckily we have a caption which reads, "Surrounded by an admiring throng, these boys, dressed as old women, gave an animated dialogue on the relative merits of meat and vegetables. They repeated the performance 20 times in 2 days." So this is a part of the kind of the Red Cross, showcasing the Red Cross work at this festival. They're putting on this little skit. And you can see actually the beetroots and stuff at their feet there, which I really love. So they're doing this performance. They do it 20 times in 2 days. These efforts are often quite considerable, as well as these boys. Here's another example. This is Lucille Mayers from Watertown, Wisconsin, who posed as the ministering nurse in the Red Cross tableau performed on the 14th of July, 1917 from 2 p.m. to 9 p.m. So she just stood there like that. I mean, there was probably other people part of the action. They did these tableau things. She just stood there like that for like however many hours that is, 8 hours, 6 hours or whatever. So these archives also contain some photographs of children's creative work. This is a collection of 9 photographs of drawings made by children in the Russian city of Archangel. And it's actually, I think this is quite a significant little collection because these drawings, as well as the toys made by these children, were sent to the US in thanks in an exchange that is often described as the beginning of the Red Cross Schools correspondence scheme. Now, I want to dig into this example a little bit more just to show you how much these images can reveal or open up. So in 1919, the American military was in Russia as part of an effort to sway the outcome of the Civil War against the Bolshevik government, and as well as to assist Czechoslovak forces who had been stranded in Siberia. As historian Julia Irwin has noted, the US government also hoped to win hearts and minds, to persuade the Russians of the legitimacy of both the US intervention and of the white Russian anti-Bolshevik government. So sound a little bit familiar, it's little echoes of the early echoes of the kind of Cold War. So the US occupied the northwestern city of Archangel, and following them to provide relief to US troops was the American Red Cross, who initially actually had no intention of working with the local population, with whom they were deeply unpopular. But the American consul Felix Cole was wise enough to realize that, and I quote, "It would be politically unwise if the non-combatants in North Russia were to be driven to Bolshevism on account of starvation." Indeed. So when the Americans were notified that schools in Archangel were going to close due to declining attendance as children did not have enough energy to attend, they set up a school lunch program distributing cocoa and biscuits to keep the schools open. You can see some of this here. In response to this, Archangel children who had been told about the American Junior Red Cross sent handmade toys and the cards I showed you earlier to America. They also made a whole collection of miniature objects to showcase everyday life in Russia, such as this tiny samovar. This is a tiny miniature samovar. If you don't know what a samovar is, it's kind of like a cool teapot thing that's kind of self-heating. And this came with a little note that said, "Thanks for the cocoa." This gift to American children is described in the American Red Cross accounts as spontaneous and self-initiated, focused on sharing something of life in Russia, which, whether true or not, disrupts the binary I discussed earlier. Here, the receivers of aid are not passive, but active and creative in their production of a gift that speaks about the reality of their lives. Now, whether we can believe these quoted passages from the American Junior magazine that we have on the slide, and I doubt that we can, which is why I'm not really going to read them out, this act of giving is significant, and it commences a process of exchange that expands to become a key component of the Junior Red Cross programming for at least the next 70 years. Throughout that period, thousands and thousands of these kind of albums and friendship albums and letters are exchanged from children all around the world. But the toys from the children of Archangel weren't the only ones to be sent to America. It took me quite a while to crack the mystery of these 2 images on the left, which I found with no description whatsoever in the Library of Congress. But eventually I found the image on the right, which looks surprisingly similar to the images on the left, and I was able to put it all together. The caption on the image of the right says, "Queer, expressive little toys made by crippled children of Prague, Czechoslovakia." And some more research told me that these toys were actually made by disabled children who attended a school run by the innovative Czech pedagogue František Bakule. Now, the toys are later explained in a Red Cross magazine as pine cone pigs, stalks made from cones and an acorn mounted on a piece of tree bark with a little twig attached to simulate a gnarled dead tree. A pheasant made from an acorn and bits of twig and feather. So that's a pheasant down the bottom, mounted on a piece of rough bark. And there's also acorn rabbits, and the kind of description goes on. So Bakule's school and the work of his children is extensively photographed and documented. So there's hundreds of photographs of these kids, and it will constitute an important part of the story I want to tell in this period. A story that in the process will have to grapple with how these images were used in perhaps a way that in the contemporary world we might at times gloss as a form of disability porn. So critical disability studies will be vital here in theorizing these images. I've put some of the more milder examples up. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, it's because I haven't put up the more extreme representations used here. But I think working with these images will also entail grappling with the ways in which, like the Indigenous children described at the start of the paper, much of the narrative surrounding these children's creative contributions emphasizes their productivity and usefulness to society. It's about making these children useful. Yet this narrative will also have to account for the ways these children depicted themselves and their disability, as in this drawing by one of the Bakule children, who draw a group of children and Dr. Bakule following a Red Cross shooting star with an American flag. You can see that people have different kind of levels of disability there. So as the Bakule's children's work traveled to America, it also highlighted the limitations of simplistic framing of children as either givers or recipients of aid. An article penned in 1920 by a teacher at South Philadelphia High School for Girls explains how her class visited and responded to an exhibition of the work of Bakule's pupils. Each child was given the opportunity to write a letter which the teacher suggested would, quote, open the door a little bit to the beginnings of friendship with some American children. The next day when children were sharing their letters in class, one girl was silent, and the teacher noted, Charlotte, who had been raised in the Hebrew shelter for destitute children, broke down over her letter. She told me privately afterwards that she felt glad those children could know that she could understand them because she had had trouble herself. But she added, I couldn't read about it out loud. The teacher then includes a copy of Charlotte's letter, which states, when I was 5 years old, my mother died and left behind her a large family of small children. My father was ill, so an older sister and I were put into an institution. I was separated from my sister and brother and put to board with an old woman. 2 years later, my father died, and I felt that there was nothing left for me to care about. The institution thought it would be good for me to be with my brother and sister. I went there, but not for long, for I became ill and had to be sent away from my sister again, and I never returned. My life among different classes of people I will not try to describe because I am trying to forget those experiences. I'm getting older, but I miss my mother more and more. When I think of you and your wonderful willpower, I feel how very insignificant my troubles were. I've been thinking only of myself and not others. Now I think I shall have new power to do something that is worthwhile. It's quite a powerful letter, actually, I think, revealing of like significant trauma, but also a moment of recognition with these children from the other side of the world. Another letter from this class also alludes to the difficulty of rarefying particular ideas about Americanism and American aid at this time. Now, this letter begins by noting that the author, Pauline, has incredible admiration for the Bakule children, but she concludes by saying, I wish to add one more thing before closing my letter. I am in this country 3 years and 9 months. I came over from Russian Poland on December 18th, 1916. I like it here very much. May success never fail you is the wish of your American friend. So again, we see these kind of signs of movement, this disruption of this kind of, pure whiteness or pure kind of American identity or kind of questions to be raised about it when we read this kind of material here. So I guess the moral of this story is that following the miniature samovar and the acorn pheasant might take you on multiple loops around the world. Or to be more specific, it might show something of the other networks of humanitarian exchange, which produce and animate and sustain and make concrete it's something of what humanitarianism is, or something of the feeling of what humanitarianism is. But how can we tell these stories? Some, as I have shown, are so fleeting and fragmentary, whereas others could open up into research projects in their own right. So my answer to this question, which I'm about to show you in a second, is only one possible answer, but it was deeply influenced by several factors. Firstly, I did not think I could do justice to the incredible richness and power of this huge archive of visual material in a non-visual medium. And secondly, given these efforts have come to us with either very little description or already very much storied by adults, I did not feel that I could do anything but try as an adult to create a different set of stories about them. Thus, my account does not purport to be true to these children's experiences or a true account of the history of children's involvement with humanitarianism. What it does seek to do is to be an account that is driven by the traces of children's creative work and that seeks to encourage reflection about children's role in humanitarianism. But the question remained as to how to practically do this. But the answer came to me when I found Joka, who would come to be the start of my graphic novel project, which at first I thought actually might be a children's book, but I soon got way too much material and I was like, no, this is a graphic novel. So this is Joka as I found him in the archives. His image caption read, orphans with startling futurist tendencies. It continued, Joka, one of the lost children in the Junior Red Cross American orphanage in Podgorica, Montenegro, let his playful instincts run riot when he stuck his hands in a can of blue paint and decorated the pet white rabbit of the school until it looked like a living piece of ultra-futurism of one of the best schools. Now he's doing penance and watching the good children at play in the courtyard below, dreaming perhaps of a world of blue rabbits and purple cats. Now, the single question mark around his name perhaps calls into question whether Joka is even this little boy's name. And as for the caption, this is nothing other than a little story made up by an adult, a story that in part comes at the expense of the child who we see here being punished while we chuckle at what he has done. So it might seem strange to make Joka the star of the story, but in many ways I think he's a great guide for what is essentially a story about the stories adults tell about children and their creativity. And along with his rabbit, which is he's also a key protagonist in my story, he's also an excellent guide for exploring the stories adults tell to children and the possibility for telling a different set of stories to both adults and children alike. So as I started to think about the evolution of Joka, I started thinking about how do I create this? How do I create this graphic novel? And I wanted to use simple and cheap, readily available materials like the kinds children might use, things like brown paper rather than white paper, like scissors and glue. I was inspired by the kind of the cutout frieze that I showed you at the start, made by French children, and also by the kind of scrapbooks that I'd seen from the World War I period. Now, this is a scrapbook actually made by an American nurse called Alma A. Clark, but it contains a number of French children's drawings and letters that she collected while she was serving with the American Red Cross in France during the war. So I was kind of inspired by this color scheme, the kind of the cutout idea, and I eventually came to my own vision of Joka. That's me doing my cutouts. That's Joka as he appears in the novel in the same scene that he is in that photograph that I found him. So my graphic novel story starts here with this act of creation on the part of Joka painting the rabbit. And then it moves to this moment of chastisement by the adult figure telling off Joka. And then I'll read the start of the text here. And it says, I think we can all see what has happened here. Things like this have happened before. They will happen again. Maybe this is how art is born over and over again. And then I says, this is not particularly a new idea, though it was briefly new to me until I found out that French philosopher Georges-Henri Lequet wrote in his 1930 book, L'Art Primitif, that the observation of actual present-day children seems to establish that each of our children reinvents figurative drawing for himself, as if he were the very first artist. And Lequet's observations were based primarily on his own daughter, Simone, and I've got some of her drawings to model. So while Lequet describes children's marks as assertion of their personalities, another French philosopher, Georges Bataille, in response to Lequet, suggests that it is always a question of the alteration of objects, whether the object is a wall, a sheet of paper, or a toy. This alteration both destroys and transforms the object, leading Bataille to conclude, art, since undeniably there is art, proceeds in this way by successive destructions. And we see the successive destruction of the rabbit and then the rabbit's creation. So then I take my story to the archives where I've been primarily working, and I say, perhaps history proceeds in much the same way, even when it is preserved in archives. And I give the archival picture of Joka. And then I say, here our subject is altered. He is named Joka. He is located in time, 26 August 1920, and in place, Podgorica, Montenegro. What this archive doesn't tell us, but the Red Cross recorded elsewhere, was that in 1920, Joka was one of an estimated 30,000 war orphans in Montenegro. And he was just one of an estimated 6 million children orphaned by World War I. Now, this map on the slide, which I've made from cutout colored paper, which I actually got given as call slips while I was doing my National Library Fellowship on children's creative work participation in humanitarianism. These call slips are coming in very useful for this project, which again is about using materials ready to hand. But to make this map, I was inspired by this map here on the slide by the Dutch editorial cartoonist Louis Reymaker, who was a fierce critic of the German invasion of Belgium and France, and he played a key role in Allied propaganda with his internationally acclaimed war cartoons, of which this is one, which is called The Insane Asylum. And here I've reconfigured it as a kind of orphans map of Europe, highlighting a kind of, I guess, different history of the conflict with different protagonists, not the kind of the leaders pictured in this map here, or the combatants. And then I kind of go on to kind of unpack this idea of orphans. So I say war orphans were typically considered any child who had a father killed by the conflict. Thus, many orphans had surviving mothers or other family members. While some countries distinguish between part orphans and full orphans, both the category and the numbers associated with it appear flexible and ill-defined. And this is a kind of a page that's about kind of my research, thinking about whether and how war orphans were counted in particular countries. They weren't counted in all countries. Different countries had different policies, and even within countries like France, there was massive inequality between the aid that was given to children of colonial soldiers who were killed in the war, as opposed to those who were killed by kind of French soldiers. So there's really interesting questions about how children are counted and how the movement of orphans, this becomes a particular issue when we start considering the Armenian genocide as well, because the practice of kind of collecting orphans and trying to kind of convert them to Islam by putting them as Islamic orphanages is a big deal in the kind of Ottoman territories. So there's all these questions that are kind of being kind of represented here that will be unpacked as the story goes on. But then I move to this page where I say, conceptually though, we are all very familiar with the stories about orphans. Kimball, writing about orphan characters in children's literature, tells us that orphans are at once pitiable and noble. They're manifestations of loneliness, but they also represent the possibility for humans to reinvent themselves. Orphans begin with a clean slate because they do not have parents to influence them, either for good or for evil. They embody the hope that whatever the present situation, it can change for the better. When orphans succeed against all odds, their success ultimately becomes ours. And these are just some famous literary orphans. You might recognize some of them, not all of them. And then I go here and I say, so the story of Joka's futurist tendencies is simply one of many stories told about orphans by those desperately hoping for a better future. And then I have me and I say, and this story is no exception. So I'm still working on this. I don't have the full story for you here today, but I just wanted to share with you this first part of the story, just to give you a sense of kind of where I'm heading, how I've represented it visually, and how I'm going to be grappling with the kind of historical materials, as well as trying to tell these kind of complex stories of children's involvement. As the story goes on, Joka and his rabbit will travel through some of the creative works drawn by children, and some of the toys and drawings will actually kind of come to life and become part of the story that is at the same time going to be grappling with the kind of adult produced material about children in this period. So yeah, thank you everyone. I hope I haven't gone too far over time. Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much, Artie. That was just really fantastic. And this work is awesome. It is really wonderful graphic work, like just exhilarating. Absolutely superb and beautiful, working with text and image and document. I think this looks extraordinary.
Thanks. Paul.
But anyway, enough from me. I'm going to call for comments and questions. Rocco's got a question at the back.
Hi, thanks for that. Just repeating, great graphics and the questions about the graphics involved. One, you seem to have made a deliberate choice not to show facial features apart from your own with the glasses. So if you could comment on that. And the other question about the product is whether you're going to go into a description of the actual real history of it as well as part of the context for it when it finally gets published.
Yeah, so definitely. So it is going to be a combination of this kind of the real history of the events as well as this. In terms of the decision about facial features, I think it is one that I made to highlight the fact that we don't know these children. We get these images of them. We get these, if I can go back to Joka, there he is. There we go. We get these images of them, but I'm not really purporting to tell his story. We don't know his story. It'd probably be very difficult to try and recreate it, although I'm going to kind of do my best. But I think, I guess I tried to not include the specific photo features to highlight the way there's this element of this kind of generic child figure that moves around, and the way we need to actually accept that in many ways we don't have the historical sources to flesh out who these children are. But I also wanted to actually do justice to the kind of the work that they've done, but without claiming to actually tell their stories, because I think that's actually probably impossible in many cases. Not in all cases, and there's some children we can definitely kind of, I guess, reconstruct more about than others. And in some cases, when I've taken images from actual photographs like these photographs are all real children from archival photographs. This little boy is a kind of a French orphan, and these photographs are from the kind of the British war families archival collection of kind of war families. So when I do use kind of real images, I do kind of want to reference them and stuff as well. But I also want to highlight the gaps, I guess, and where there is this kind of space of unknowability. Yeah. Oh, yes, these are the...
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm really interested in the massive genre shift between a kid's book and the graphic novel that you're producing. Could you just talk a little more about the realization that this was not supposed to be the kind of monster that you initially thought it was, and what that sort of felt like to come to that realization?
Yeah, I think to me, I just kind of, it was almost like I just kind of realized I mean, I've always wanted to write a children's book, and I think there is a children's book in this story. There would be a case for a children's book, but I think I have to do this first. I think I have to get this material through, and I'm kind of using this as almost a kind of research process to think through how to use these visual materials and create a different kind of research product, I think I'm going to need to create this first. Maybe I will end up at a children's book, as well at the end. But I think for me, I feel like this narrative that I'm crafting is part of the kind of the research project. And I don't think I can arrive at a children's book just straight there. And I think I'm not a creative, haven't done this kind of creative work before. So it's not something that I'm kind of used to doing. I'm much more used to writing in kind of academic writing. So to me, to kind of make that leap, maybe this is also an intermediary kind of product. I'm not sure, but I think there is a children's story in here, but I think there's also this story in here as well. And I think hopefully I'll ultimately tell both of them, but yeah, it would depend. Yeah.
Wow, brilliant, Artie. Stunning presentation and such exciting work. You're right, scholars have not engaged enough with the Junior Red Cross archives. Huge collections around the world, including in Australia. In Melbourne and Sydney, which I hope you can access, may not be digitised, but there's a huge photographic collection and ephemera. My question is, have you thought about using the Japanese Red Cross? It had a large Junior Red Cross and is a great case study on non-Western children.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. That's a really good question. Yes, I have thought about using the Japanese Red Cross, and it's something that is definitely, I'd love to do more work on them. I know that they're very active and they do have a large Junior Red Cross. I have been to the Red Cross archives in Melbourne, not in Sydney yet. So I'm definitely interested in, I guess, crafting this more of a kind of a project that looks at the Junior Red Cross as an international effort, rather than focusing on particular countries. So yeah, getting to look at the Japanese Red Cross is definitely on my list, and I'm trying to find these different ways of weaving these kind of threads in there. But there'll definitely be a way to do that. So it's just kind of growing it, and to build up this kind of picture of the Junior Red Cross as this kind of international organization with the kind of circulations that come with that. And that's what I'm particularly interested in. But thanks a lot, Melanie. Thanks for listening. Yeah, it could be a lifetime project. I know, Melanie, you've spent your lifetime working on a lot of this stuff. So thank you for listening today.
Artie, can I direct a question to you?
Yeah.
And it goes back to the first part of your paper.
Yeah.
Where you gave that fascinating analysis of, you were quoting Malika, I think was the ethnographer, and talking about the way children's creativity is often dismissed, even when it is put forward as an example of how these populations are breaking out of stereotyped categories of giver and receiver. And I'm wondering if there is something about the figure of creativity itself that gets dismissed because of associations with children, whether in these contexts or not. I'm thinking about the word seriousness, and that gets used as such a valorized term in so many different contexts. So I guess I want to ask you to comment on the association between creativity and childishness, I think is what I'm getting.
I think it's a really good question, because I do think, I don't know how to say it, but it definitely rubs off both ways. I think definitely the kind of like the association of kind of this work is dismissed because it's kind of considered children's work, but then creativity itself or creative forms of expression are often removed from the political realm. And I guess what I'm trying to highlight is these things are in the political realm. They're political productions. They're often political statements, are often asserting particular facts about who one is and who one isn't. But yeah, I think it does go both ways. And I definitely think there's a kind of a sense of, this idea of seriousness or non-seriousness or triviality or just kind of creative production or something that I also want to unpack. Like, in a way, this book project is also grappling with questions about art. What is art? What is children's art? And how does it play this role? So you remember that Joka is described his work is described as a futurism. And actually the second chapter of this book is all about it's all about futurism and how the futurists were actually they were terrible. They were really into war. They really, like, the Italian futurists literally rode off to war. They really couldn't get enough of it. And so the second chapter is actually about futurism. It takes this little detour through that to highlight this kind of the way art is entangled in this kind of story as well before coming back. So yeah, and I think, Anyway, sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but I think that there's questions about art here and what art means and how it's political and how it's not.
Well, I think you're answering in the structure of the book. In the sequence that you showed us where you had Bataille quoted on page 2 or something in relation to Joka's creativity, that gets us straight into this space, because I don't think that's a typical use of Bataille's theory of art making, for instance.
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because I found it because in particular it was this because Bataille was responding to this guy Lequette, the French guy. I can't go back now, but this guy Lequette, I'm really interested in, where he did his work. He collected all of his daughter's drawings, and that was his PhD project. And he wrote about children's drawings, and he was making these parallels, which are, I guess, problematic towards kind of the development of primitive art and children's art, putting them as one kind of thing. And this is kind of what Bataille is responding to. But I think it's super interesting, and I think these ideas about children's art and what it is and where it comes from are really key, and then to the way this creativity later gets used and co-opted and circulated. So I'm kind of key to unpacking those kind of questions and the more philosophical dimensions of that as well, if possible. Yeah.
Surely. Further comments or questions?
Thanks for this presentation. When I came, I had a different conception, and this was an overwhelming, the kind of research that has gone into, and the kind of accounts you have brought in here, and the way the things have been used. I mean, it's a kind of changing the perspective also. So during this journey, what was something challenging for you, or while you were thinking or planning that this is how you will go?
I guess I know. I think it is kind of challenging in a way to think about what to do with this material, how to do it, how much to be creative around it. I guess in a way, as I said, I'm not that used to doing creative work. This is a creative project. It will have these creative elements to it, but I also want to be always kind of coming back to these archival fragments, these archival materials, and like drawing them out, because I think there is so much in the archive actually that showcases this. So it's more about the difficulty for me is like how to strike that balance and how to kind of make those connections, and to really ground it in the things that children did make, but to ask questions about that, because we don't know why they made them. We get these narratives from the Red Cross about how they were so grateful to the Americans and all that kind of thing. The American Red Cross just constantly is just constantly repeating this idea about how people are so grateful to them. And if you read books by Americans about the Red Cross, they kind of repeat very similar this kind of narrative. So again, something that's not just about that, something that's taking these objects kind of as objects and trying to think with them creatively, not necessarily kind of being a stickler to, solely focus on kind of the generation of historical facts, but being able to think with these objects and think how they mobilize these particular ideological positions and how they come to be used and how they come to reflect upon children and who they are and how they're key to our understandings of what it is to respond to one another as fellow humans. So I guess, yeah.
Thanks. And maybe just connecting that, what has specifically motivated you to pick up this project?
Well, I guess for ages I've been really interested in this because, well, when I was in India, I was working with kids there, slum children, and they just were producing stuff all the time. And the NGOs were mostly, they might take one good drawing or something, put it on their Facebook, and then they'd just bin all the other stuff. And I started looking around the world, NGOs, children are constantly producing things in NGOs, even in like really severe kind of war, situations of war or whatever, they're still producing things. And that some of those things, most of them don't see the light of day, but I'm interested in what it is that's happening. And when we just get these exemplars that circulate around the world, like the winner of this UNICEF competition or the winner of this, and we never see kind of the kind of extent of the production. And I guess I'm interested in what this production is doing and why it's important. Obviously, from an adult perspective, it's about teaching children about the world and, internationalism and the peace and all these kind of things. But I'm interested in what it is that children actually do when they produce these things. And I think children often take these things very seriously and put a lot of effort into them. So it's a shame, actually, that adults don't always accord them the same degree of respect, I think. So I guess I'm interested in thinking through those kind of questions as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we'll call it a day then, and please join me in thanking Artie for a really fascinating presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.